A great chief people officer has to really think about AI in their strategy, both for the people function itself, as well as driving organizational performance and change.
Welcome back to 40-Minute Mentor, the podcast on a mission to raise aspirations and inspire the next generation of category-defining founders, all in just 40 minutes. Today, we're joined by Jevan Soo Lenox, Chief People Officer at Writer, a leader in agentic AI for the enterprise. Founded in 2020, Writer helps businesses launch products faster, run deeper financial research and clinical trials. The high-growth startup is backed by some of the best investors in the world, including Balderton, Radical Ventures, ICONIQ Growth, Salesforce Ventures, Adobe Ventures, and many more. Before joining Writer, Jevan already held multiple CPO roles in hypergrowth businesses, including Blue Bottle Coffee, Stitch Fix, and Inistro. With so much experience in building people-centric, high-performing cultures across North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific, I can't wait to dig into his many lessons that Jevan has no doubt learned throughout his career and hear more about his brand new role with the Writer team. So, Jevan, a big warm welcome to 40-Minute Mentor. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me, James.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you for taking the time from what I know is a very busy job. So I am incredibly grateful. We always like to warm up our guests with some quick fire questions to start. So if you don't mind, please can you finish the following sentences after me? Number one, the moment that defined my career was when?
Moving to Shanghai with McKinsey and leading recruiting across 12 countries in Asia.
Wow. Okay, that's a great experience, I'm sure, and a big role. So looking forward to hearing a bit more about that in a minute. The biggest lesson I've learned about leadership is...
Leading through questions, not answers.
Oh, that's good. That's a good one. Thank you. A skill I wish I had mastered earlier in my career is...
Giving tough feedback to senior people, especially my bosses.
Okay, yeah. I'm sure a lot of our listeners will resonate with that one. And if I could change one thing about how companies build teams, it would be...
Embracing and supporting rapid evolution of teams.
Love that. Oh, Jevan, thank you. We're can't wait to dive into your experience. Your CV is exceptional, so I'm very excited. But I'm going to start, like I always do, by going back in time, and I'd love to hear a bit more about your upbringing, and particularly interested in where this kind of love, the people function, has come from.
Yeah, so I grew up in suburban New Jersey in a little town. I'm second generation Chinese American, and I was a closeted gay little kid in that suburban town. And I was an introverted bookworm. So I think all of that sort of puts you, and I was, one of the only Chinese kids in town, all the stuff, right? So a lot of onlys. And I think that sort of puts you a little bit, at least for me as a personality, a little bit kind of quiet, trying not to stand out, but spending a lot of time observing others and actually thinking about what makes other people tick. And so that I think kind of wired me to really just be curious and interested about other people, particularly people who are different than me, and what makes them excited, what drives them. And, there are all these alternate reality careers that I've actually considered at different times in psychology, in marketing, but you can sort of tell they all come back to this central idea of just humans are complicated and unique. And how do you kind of crack the code on any individual or group of people?
It's so true. It kind of totally makes sense now you described it, how you've ended up where you are. But I know there's been a lot of hard work, a lot of lessons along the way. So we'll dive into those. You've held 5 chief people officer roles today, which is incredibly impressive. So do you mind giving our listeners that might not know your CV as well a kind of whistle-stop tour through it and share some of your personal highlights from along the way?
Yeah, my career has had 2 major chapters. The first was at McKinsey and Company, which is a management consultancy. I started as a consultant right out of college, working with a pretty wide variety of companies, wide variety of topics. And I just found that I kept being drawn to this kind of topics of people. And all my extracurriculars at McKinsey were in recruiting, were in training, mentoring more junior analysts, and so on. And so I moved into what was meant to just be kind of a 1-year experiment of rotating into McKinsey's recruiting group. And that turned into 2 years. This was in North America. And then got asked to move to Shanghai and take over recruiting strategy across the entire APAC region. So this was 12 countries at the time, from South Korea over to India, down to New Zealand, and all the major economies in between. And that is where I really started falling in love with the people function, because every morning I was working on something different, on a country with a totally different education system, totally different economy, totally different competitive landscape for McKinsey. It was just such a strategic playground, and it was all fundamentally about getting great people in the door and then helping them succeed once they were here. But some pretty really different talent markets, really different local cultures, and so on. And so that was when I kind of got bit the bug. And then the second chapter was jumping into high growth companies, starting with Square when they were about 400 employees pre IPO in their hyper growth days, which is where I first worked for a founder, Jack Dorsey, which is a good place to start. And first worked with engineers. First, I think time it being inside a company and seeing what being at a really mission driven company, a really customer obsessed company, what that can do in terms of culture and driving performance. And then I've really taken that with me through a variety of other companies. I am a bit of an industry hopper. So I went from fintech at Square to Blue Bottle Coffee, food and beverage hospitality, which is so fun. Just, such a hands-on product, really amazing place to build culture. And then off to Stitch Fix and e-commerce and retail. And then most recently before Writer in Citro, which is AI drug discovery. And the last two companies, both Stitch Fix and Citro, had AI and machine learning at their core, trying to really transform how retailers, marketers, merchandisers, stylists, warehouse workers at Stitch Fix do their work, and then research biologists, drug discoverers at In Citro. And so for the last 8 years or so, I've become really passionate about this collision of this new wave of technology and human work. And now at Writer, I get to be on a much broader canvas because we work with enterprise companies across all different industries, helping them realize value.
Yeah, incredible. What a diverse, rich tapestry of a CV. And it's something you said really resonated with me. I feel as a headhunter in the tech space, we're sector agnostic, business model agnostic. Probably maybe 60% of our clients are B2B, but 40% are consumer or marketplaces. And we work across different stages, and that variety and the different functional expertise and the different geographical searches we do. I just love that. I think variety really is the spice of life. So I can totally see how in your experience, clearly there's a lot of curiosity there that is taking you to lots of different areas. So that can only make you better at the job. I think that's really cool to hear. I'd like to kind of take you back to that first time you took the step up to being a chief people officer. What helped you sort of settle into that role? Were there things that you perhaps could pass on to our listeners who are maybe sort of looking to make that step up? Anything that you would recommend or think get them to think about?
So in the first CPO job, which was at Blue Bottle Coffee, I entered with fairly tremendous imposter syndrome. Was taking this on, still relatively early in my career and had never done it before. It had never been in a coffee business. So there are a lot of haven't done, haven't done, haven't done. And I think the two things that really helped me settle into the role, the first was really building trust and connection with a number of other executives on the executive team. There can be a challenging dynamic if the CPO gets put into a more transactional or service relationship with the rest of the executive team. You really need to be in a pure relationship with them. You obviously need to deliver the things that you need to deliver, but those relationships, that trust becomes really important, both for your success and also your own sanity. And I was lucky. There were just some really wonderful people on that leadership team. And so rapidly within the first few months, we're working through different things. And I was going after a few strategic initiatives, building that momentum, building that excitement, building that connection, learning from them. I mean, there's so much that I had to understand about the business. That those relationships really start sort of settling you down and calming you down. And then building your own team. When you take the CPO job, particularly at high growth companies, you're often building the team pretty tremendously. By nature, the function often hasn't kept up with the growth. You're coming in to set the foundation for this new chapter and so on. And, early on, it's stressful because you're doing a lot yourself. And it's also pretty lonely, actually, right? When you're trying to figure things out. And so on both dimensions, these lateral relationships with the rest of the executive team, and then the relationships with your own team and building your own leaders, those become really important, I think, for your success.
Totally, yeah. Thank you very much for sharing. And in your opinion, what makes someone a truly great and impactful CPO? What are some of the most important skills that you need to hone and exhibit?
I think the most impactful CPOs fundamentally think about their job as driving business results and priorities through people and organization. And I have this sort of little inside joke that I'm one of the less warm and fuzzy chief people officers out there because Culture and morale is to win. It's not actually just to exist in isolation. It's not its own intrinsic good. If you're a for-profit company and you have a board and investors and down the road, public market so folks, right? You're accountable. You're here to do something, right? And so I think you need to think about the fundamental outcomes of what you're doing as driving that overall business success. And I think that the skills that become really important to that, first, I would say really translating the business strategy and focusing on what matters most into your own people priorities. There's so much to do in the people function, and it's a pretty wide and vast array of pretty disparate things. And when you're joining a high growth company in particular, you can just look at the mountain of stuff and get pretty overwhelmed pretty fast going into month 4 of this job. So this is me coaching myself, actually mentoring myself. But you have to really zoom out and think about what really matters most right now. And again, if you use the business goals and priorities as that lens, that can help you really focus in the right way. The second I would say is pattern recognition. And that can show up in a bunch of different ways. Obviously, as you're more experienced, you've just seen more things go well and go wrong and can drive off of that. It can be patterns across companies and organizations, across businesses. One of the fun things for me now that I've done so many different industries is I see patterns that are sometimes unexpected because I've been in very vastly different environments, but I see commonalities around organizational challenge or commonalities around people and culture and how they develop and so on. And being able to rapidly recognize those patterns, ascertain implications from them, see around corners, helping your CEO see around corners is a real superpower for this role. And the last I would say is truth seeker and truth teller. So I think if you're doing this role right, people really see that you will say the hard things to other leaders, particularly to your CEO. They will seek you out to give you those truths because they know that you will wield those truths with good purpose and impact. And others will seek you out to hear those truths, right? So it becomes this virtuous cycle if you do it well, but it's not easy to find that balance.
Yeah, brilliant points. Thank you very much for sharing. And the CPO is clearly a very impactful, strategic. There's a lot of variety to it. It's a great role, but it's also difficult. And I think it's important to share the harder parts. So we'd love to hear your take on what those more difficult parts of the role are, and what have been some of the biggest challenges you've had to face and overcome over the course of your sort of career as a CPO.
I told one of my former CEOs that being the chief people officer is like being the rain gutter for the organization, that everything flows through you, right? It sort of funnels in and everything kind of comes through you. And if you're doing it well, beautiful, pure rainwater flows out. And then you're left with all this kind of detritus because you see kind of all of the hard things, all of the rough things of the organization. That takes a toll, takes an emotional toll, to be honest. You see the hardest things across the entire organization. I've had CEOs say to me, you probably see the most comprehensive view of the company next to me as CEO because of the nature of the role, but it's often a lot of the toughest things. So that I think is challenging. Being in this role means there are going to be times where you are very disliked. And there are always going to be employees that fundamentally see the people team as out to get them, right? Only representing the company's best interests. And you are the fundamental symbol of that power, of that hierarchy. And so I think over time, I've become accustomed to and more resilient to the fact that people project that apprehension, the past resentments, past scar tissue onto you. But it's tough. Sometimes I get into a human conversation with people, I'll say, I'm just another human being. I do sort of, occupy an advantage point of certain power and certain influence and so on, right? But at the end of the day, I'm just another person trying to do right. And so I'm not saying I always do it right, but I think it can be really hard when you get put in this position where it feels people don't think of you as a human being, candidly. Right? They just see you as an agent of bad things. And I think, as a result of those earlier sort of points, your ability to keep empathy over time becomes hard, but really vitally important, right? I say to a lot of my team members, when we're doing something hard or sharing something hard, if you didn't care anymore, that would actually be a bad thing. I don't want you to lose your empathy. I don't want to lose your heart. That's really important. But keeping the empathy means you feel bad and you get hurt sometimes, but losing it makes you not effective at your job. And all of that, I think, just combines. I feel like I'm scaring off every possible chief people officers listening to this podcast, but it's a lonely job, similar to the CEO job. Again, CEOs have told me this, right? Because you don't have a peer. It's hard to confide in and build relationships in the same way that other C-suite execs can with each other, right? They know that you occupy a certain seat and you have a certain relationship with the CEO and so on. And so great piece of advice that someone once gave me was just, if you know you can't find that, you have to find it elsewhere, right? And so it's unsurprising that you see a lot of really strong chief people officer networks. I've got a really amazing cadre of chief people officer friends here in the Bay Area in particular, because we have to form that community for each other, right? We have to sort of buck each other up.
That's so true. Thank you for being so honest. And I think actually it's really important other people that are either just starting their careers in the people function or progressing to the stage you're at. They hear the reality of what it takes. It is lonely, but it's also incredibly impactful, rewarding. You've had an incredible career, but actually getting the right mentors around and getting peer mentorship is one of the most common things we talk about on this podcast, is actually so important. So you don't feel as alone. And as a before our company was acquired, I was a bootstrap founder for 12 years, and it was incredibly lonely at times. And actually, it was only when I started looking outwards and talking to other founders of search firms that I actually started to feel, okay, others are in this boat with me. We can learn from each other. I know someone I can call when I need to vent. So it's really important. So thank you for being so open. How have you seen the CPO role evolve over the years? I mean, this must have sort of changed a lot, especially as you've moved between different industries. I'd love to know what is more important now than it used to be and what still remains the same.
I think what remains the same is what we talked about earlier, right? Really thinking about your role as driving business results and the components of supporting your CEO and doing that and doing your own work. I think what's different is technology. So when I first got into this, you kind of thought about your HRIS and maybe a few other ancillary tools kind of thing. And then I think over the last decade or so, not to date myself, there's been a proliferation of HR tech and innovative vendors and companies that are really making various aspects of the HR tech stack and the HR experience much more consumer grade, if you will, right? For end users, driving analytics and insight in a much more powerful way. So that's all been great. And so I think, over the last 5 to 10 years, a great chief people officers had to really lean into that and think about technology as an enabler. And now with the advent of AI, and this being on, everyone's sort of top of mind, a great chief people officer has to really think about AI in their strategy, both for the people function itself, as well as driving organizational performance and change. And we're still relatively early days on this, right? I think all of us are doing our best, sharing ideas and so on. But I think this role is going to be completely transformed in the next several years. It's already in the process of doing so. And again, everything we've talked about, I think, remains true, but how AI suffuses all of it and becomes one of the first things you think about in any organizational decision will be very, very new relative to what it felt like years ago.
Yeah, totally. And what a better place to work, given what you've just said, at one of the fastest growing AI companies. I mean, it makes total sense. As you mentioned earlier, you're 4 months into your role at Writer, and you're hired as the business's first ever chief people officer, which is must be an honor, but also come with a bit of pressure. So, can you share a bit more about Writer as a business? What made you want to join the business at this sort of stage? What does the business do? And then we'll maybe talk a bit more about what your actually role entails.
So, Writer is an agentic AI platform that helps enterprise companies realize tremendous ROI through AI. We particularly specialize in complex workflows, reinventing workflows that create business value. And we deliver in our platform things that really matter to enterprise companies, privacy and security, the ability to observe across the platform what activity is happening, advanced controls, roles, and permissions, the things that you think about when you're a larger company. And you really want this tool and this platform to be widely used, but you also need to manage that in a thoughtful way and to have visibility into it to really ensure that you're harnessing and driving the best business outcomes kind of coming out of it. And I joined because when I was first starting to get to know Writer and hearing about this relentless enterprise focus. And looking at the broader market, there are companies going after the consumer side. And then there are companies that are going after very specific niches of industry and function. But there really weren't a lot of folks who were thinking about this sort of specific enterprise approach and really building for that from the start and creating a broad platform that would be able to really realize these, increasingly complex cross-cutting workflows where some of these niche solutions that may do amazing things in kind of one portion of the organization will not sort of easily integrate or expand across. And that really resonated for me. I started my career at McKinsey working with large enterprise companies and seeing them from the inside and understanding what is challenging for them. And so immediately kind of clicked for me as this is a huge opportunity. The talent bar at Writer is just tremendous. I've been lucky to work at a lot of high talent places, and Writer is at the top of the top. Just incredible people at every level, masters of their craft, very, very self-driven, high bar for themselves, and very mission oriented, just wanting to do amazing work for our customers and the humans that populate our customers. And I have a mandate. You mentioned pressure. There's a good amount of it. I have a mandate from our CEO, May, to do, a couple things. The first is to really bring the product and platform into writers' people function and to build on it for obvious reasons. We got to eat our own medicine, right? If we're telling our customers and helping our customers about the great, amazing value that we can create for them, we have to shine a light and show the way within our own functions, which we're doing so. And so I'm early days in that, but the people function really want to integrate that in and also really help our customers think about their AI transformations. I think one of the funny things, but more and more organizations are realizing this, is AI is actually underneath it a people problem because you can have all these amazing tools and sure, it's going to reshape how organizations are designed and headcount ratios and so on, right? But there ultimately are still people that need to use the AI to be successful. And how you drive that, how you think about transforming how organizations work and how they coordinate and how agents work side by side with humans. These are really complex, fascinating, interesting organizational problems. And so to be at a company that's at the heart of that and asking me to lead into that is just incredibly fulfilling and motivating.
It sounds, yeah, what an amazing opportunity. And I'm sure you're doing a brilliant job. I guess there are going to be people listening to this a bit like May realize if you needed to bring in a chief people officer and hired you, there'll be founders listening to this, probably getting inspired by some of the things you're working on, thinking right now might be the time for me to make a big hire in the people space. What advice do you have for them? And what are some of the signs you've seen where companies really should be getting ahead of this? What are the typical telltale signs?
Yeah. So the classical model is scale and complexity organization, but I think things are getting reinvented so fast. It's kind of harder to use some of those metrics of like, oh, it's this, a few hundred employees. You definitely need a chief people officer exactly at that phase and so on, right? But it still is a thing. I would say if you have a people heavy business model where you have a lot of delivery orientation and so on, and having someone who's really strategic about that earlier on can be valuable. So again, what's the connection of people and organization to the heart of the business? How fast is the puck moving and where it's going, right? So if you're in hyperscaling mode, you are going to grow so fast into these, sort of growth challenges that you may want to get ahead of it and hire a chief people officer. I think about people stuff, and if you think about the Maslow's hierarchy pyramid, early on, you're just trying to, get payroll going and make sure people have their benefits and so on, right? And spin up a recruiting team and get people in the door, do some onboarding, all that kind of stuff, right? But I think you find that with success and growth, as the organization takes on, second order challenges, you'll find that you and your executive teams minds week to week are on bigger picture problems, right? How are we working together? How do we help people develop? How do we ensure that the right feedback is being delivered? These orgs are in a lot of tension in how they work together. How do we reinvent that? You're sort of starting to see it feel that shift of focus of like, oh, this is what's holding us back, right? Then this voice at the executive table and driving that work, I think becomes more and more important. I'm an odd duck. I tend to come into companies in what I call this middle school stage of company, right? So earlier stage, they're like really cute babies. They can poop on you and you still kind of think it's cute, right? And at some point, hopefully you become a full-fledged grown-up that you know what you're doing with your life. But this is the middle stage school of company, which is where I tend to be, right? Your limbs are too long for you. You have all these complicated emotions that you don't understand, right? Middle school is a really freaking hard place to be, but it's also where you kind of start turning into an adult, right? And so all of us have lived through that, and we can probably remember times where people who were kind to us and helped us navigate that time were really formative later on. So that I'm hoping that I can be that middle school dance chaperone for all the companies that I've worked with.
I love that. Thank you. And you've already alluded to sort of the incredible talent bar you have at Writer, the sort of mission oriented nature of your colleagues. But how do you describe, as chief people officer, how do you describe the culture? And what is the secret sauce there? What makes it so special?
I would start with customer obsession. So, Writer is a place that deeply cares about our customers and where we really urge people to deeply know their customers. So, I think our CEO, May, and our Chief Revenue Officer, Andy Shorkey, say, if you're not on a texting basis with your key customers, you're not in the sort of position to win, right? So, how do you build that relationship of trust, of deep insight, of deep connection? Is I think a starting point and really a critical sort of baseline. We have three values: connect, challenge, and own. And I think they really go together. We want people to be really connected, really curious about each other, really deeply seeking out others in the business for the value that they can bring to the work and to their projects. But then, based on that sort of connection and trust, to really challenge each other. Writer is a very direct culture, and I've been in other places that were lovely, but very nice, not saying the hard things. And I would say Writer, we tend to lean into the hard things and lean into them fast, which I think is fantastic. Again, you need to make sure you've got the connection and trust to do so. But once that happens, we're like, don't sit around and fester. Don't see what happens in a month. Like, just go there and say the thing, work through it. And I think, incredible things happen from that. And then own just, a tremendous sense of ownership, of self-drive, non-hierarchy. Our CEO May says, I want people to break glass, right? Of not sort of, it's like, if the fire alarm's going off, like just break some freaking glass and go do what it takes to help the business be successful, help a customer be successful. So those things work really in tandem, which I really love. And the other thing I would say is just tremendous speed. So this is one of the fastest places I've ever been at. And we are in a space that is evolving more rapidly than perhaps any other technological space that people have seen, right? And so the speed is not a nice to have. It is a survival imperative, because this is a space where radical product evolution happens in the space of months and quarters. And a market leadership position, you cannot really take for granted more than a couple quarters.
Yeah, yeah, it's so true. It's so true. You get left behind, don't you? It certainly sounds like a phenomenal place to work, and not for everyone. I think that's what I think is really important. You mentioned that we've worked in different settings, and we've had people building different cultures, and where perhaps they wouldn't fit as well into that sort of very direct place. But I find it can foster just exceptional results. Be incredibly rewarding, and I'd imagine lots of our listeners will be getting straight onto the website to apply for roles. AI isn't just part of your product, but also sort of at the core of how you're building the team. So can you share a bit more about what AI first looks like at Writer, and how does that influence the skills, behaviors, and also the mindset you're looking for in your teams?
We're lucky in that we have a head start. Anyone who comes to Writer wants to embrace AI, is curious, they have the right mindset already. So we don't need to worry a ton about people being fearful, people being resistant. They came on board here, they're kind of bought in on that front, right? But fluency will vary. Confidence will vary. Some people come in essentially almost power users already, and some people come in, they're pretty new to this. We've just revamped our onboarding pretty significantly to have a lot more hands-on keyboard product time. Like I said, not talking about the product, like get into the product, do the things. And again, because we have such a broad-based platform, it's actually easy to design around that and get people to experience it. And there's more that we want to do, right? We've done the 101. I want to do the 201, the 301, and so on, right? But being AI first, I think, fundamentally means making sure that people are just deeply immersed in the product. You need to look for people who are comfortable with ambiguity and change, who have a past record of fast learning curves and self-disruption, who are able to zoom out and almost have a big picture, almost process engineer view of their own work. These are things that I've historically looked for as well at past companies, but I think it becomes even more amplified in this new era of AI, because things are changing so quickly and your need to reinvent your own work becomes an almost constant sort of drumbeat. And so having the track record of being able to think in that way and being comfortable with that becomes really, really important.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Well, writers continue to grow incredibly quickly, and I know you had some really big, ambitious goals. And now you've seen rapid scale at the likes of Stitch Fix, which was thousands of employees globally. For anyone listening to this that is maybe taking on a bunch of VC funding, is looking to go hyper growth, what's your biggest advice to them when it comes to scaling quickly? Sort of the kind of maybe the things to think about, but also the things to watch out for.
So I'll be that ex McKinsey person and give you three things with the same letter. So three C's: culture, comms, and change management. So culture, when you're growing that rapidly, you are in a very fragile place because the easy way on culture, or easier way on culture, is the new people coming in are always far outnumbered by the existing people, right? And so you kind of assimilate them and they imprint and they learn and so on, right? But when you're in fast scaling mode, that ratio is not correct, right? And so then you just have people replicating what they've known before because that's a human thing to do. And so all of a sudden you have to become very deliberate around how you introduce culture to those new folks, how you role model for them, how you get them to imprint on it rapidly, reinforcing, when things are going well, when things are not, and so on. And we're actually in the process of a lot of that right now, just thinking through cultural reinforcement, introduction. I just had a 2.5 hour working session with our CEO and a couple leaders to really further flesh out and define our culture based on things that we're seeing today, misunderstandings of sort of certain cultural principles and so on. And then that will become an enhanced onboarding session and other things will flow from it. But culture also has to evolve too, right? So you can be really rigid and say a culture is a fly trapped in amber, and that's not right either. What I talk a lot about is the outcomes that you want for your culture, I think tend to be consistent if you've kind of gotten it right. But the way your culture manifests at different scales has to kind of evolve, right? And that actually gets to kind of the next two C's. Communications, I have to confess, earlier in my career, I said, oh, internal comms, that's like a newsletter. That's like put something on the bulletin board in the break room, whatever. And now that I've been at fast growing companies, if you get internal comms right early on in a really strategic, effective way, it is actually a competitive advantage because these are fast moving companies, fast changing companies. The opportunity for misalignment when you're growing this rapidly is so high. And so leaning into the rigor of, I sort of say, copy marketing, right? Brand campaigns, consistent messaging, proliferating that message across channels, reinforcing that message through different voices and so on, right? Like that's actually, I think, best practice. And so few of us do it. That's, again, something that we're leaning into right now at Writer, of thinking, how do we level this up to meet the moment, to meet the need? And then finally, change. Going through this kind of scaling, going through this kind of rapid organizational evolution is really, really hard. This is the middle school stage of company, right? And I think a lot of companies really underestimate just how hard it is to live through that kind of change. And they kind of leave their managers flailing because they're the ones on the front lines with their team members freaking out and being unhappy and so on, right? And so really having your leaders and leaning into support and empower your managers to lead through change and really just not shying away from the hard stuff, right? I think you have harder conversations as a manager in this stage of company, helping settle people, anchor people, and so on. And you need to be aware of that. And then you need to lean in and make sure that they are set up for success.
Yeah, unbelievable tips and advice. Thank you for sharing that, Jevan. And definitely the communication one is it's interesting. Even in a small business like mine, I remember when we were growing quite quickly, it's incredible how comms can go down because you think everyone is on the same page and thinking the same way, but often they're not. People. It's just unless you spell it out, unless there's a real consistency of message and that drumbeat, that it's very, very quickly can just sort of things can just get people go off in different directions. So it's something we see a lot with our clients. The ones that are often building the most high performing cultures, scaling the quickest, have nailed communication and everyone's sort of singing from the same hymn sheet. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. I am biased. I always like to ask questions about hiring, given what we do as headhunters. So I would love to know what your kind of go-to hiring approach is, especially as you're scaling businesses, and particularly when you're thinking about bringing in the first leaders into companies. I would love your top tips, your experience, how you do it. That would be amazing.
So, something that I care about for hiring at all levels, but particularly at senior leaders, first is self-awareness. I think a lack of self-awareness is absolute kryptonite because it means that at some point you're going to be giving feedback on something, at some point you're going to have a disagreement on something, and if someone just has a sort of reality distortion field around themselves and you can't penetrate that, I've never seen that sort of end well. And so I really look for that deep self-awareness. And that shows up in a bunch of different ways, right? I think it shows through sort of honest, authentic reflection on things that have not gone well and learnings from that. I think it can show up in just a really sort of sharp self view of where they are in they're in development and things that they're excited about in the future that they need to work on. And so I've actually asked questions about, read me your last performance review and sort of how you think about that. I ask people, particularly leaders, to walk me through a situation where they drove tremendous change and ultimately positive impact. But I focus a lot on their diagnostic phase. So I literally, anyone who interviews with me, this is an easy pro tip to prepare with me. I'll say, take me back to when you first walked into the situation. What did you see? What was the data you were looking for? What mattered to you? What would make you choose, to take this decision versus decision? Because I really want to understand not a playbook, right? So many organizations are going to have obstacles or wrinkles that mean the exact thing that you did somewhere else, you can't just sort of force fit it in. So that sharpness around diagnostic mode of where people's instincts are in terms of what they look for, how they make decisions is really, really critical. And actually turns out not that hard to dig into. So I kind of started taking this path. And then I look for first principles thinking. So again, I say that a great senior leader coming into a company, they take their own experience and they interrogate it through first principles thinking. They say, gosh, okay, I did this thing somewhere else. It's relevant to this problem at hand. What did I do there? What were the results? Why did it succeed? Is that true here? What's different here? When you see someone able to do that, I think, oh gosh, then, we've got something here because that is the best, in my view, of both worlds. They've got a track record of success. They've got lessons and insights to bring, but they are going to be super insightful about attacking their own sort of biases and experience and applying only what is most relevant and then inventing what is needed.
Yeah, really well said. Thank you very much. And when it comes to hiring at such pace and velocity, how do you do that without compromising quality or diversity, equity, and inclusion? These are sometimes things that go fall by the wayside when you're trying to hire very quickly. What are your advice for anyone that might be thinking about that?
I have been in a number of organizations that I think over rigored the process. You don't need 12 data points to make a great hire. Even for a senior exec, actually, I would say, right? You need fewer data points that are amazing. So Google famously did a study on this a number of years ago, and I think they landed around 5 strong data points in an engineer recruiting process will kind of get you where you need to go. So I sort of say to people, you don't get a merit badge for getting more data into the process. You actually win by you're getting just enough data to make a great and right decision, right? And so that actually should be your bar. It's like, what's that just enough? Not let's get double just because we'll go to 99.9% reliability. And I think around, DI, I think around other aspects, I think what often happens at these high velocity situations is you either compromise on process in general, you just get messy, you're like, go, 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 right? Or you don't sort of process engineer fully in a way that captures some of these other outcomes that you care about, right? So I think it doesn't have to always mean a binary choice. I just think you have to sort of say, these are other outcomes that we're trying to balance for, and how do we design for them and take that time to design.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously, hiring is one piece of the puzzle, but actually retaining top talent is kind of even more important in many ways. So, what would you say are the things that really matter when it comes to retaining top talent, or anything that's sort of an underrated tactic to achieve that?
I don't think it's underrated, but I think so few organizations do it well. It's development. There are surveys and research out there that show people will forego jobs with more money to stay at a place or choose a place where they think that their development will be more accelerated. And Our CEO May and I have a kind of mutual pact. We want to make writer into a place where people say, this was the most rapid acceleration of my development of any place that I've ever had in my career. This is one of your opening questions, right? Like, so how do we build an organization that does that? And part of that is being in a space and in a growth trajectory that has the fundamentals where there's just a lot of challenge, a lot of opportunity, a lot, and so on. But then part of that really means building the muscle in our managers and the patterns of behavior and the cadences of behavior where everyone has a super clear sort of vision for their own development and the manager understands that. There's a clarity of plan around how the experiences over the next 6 to 12 months could support moving towards that vision and clear activity against that plan, right? Sometimes it's really easy that the day job itself kind of lends itself. Sometimes it's a little bit, you have to sort of make extra effort to find that. But I find that when you do those things, people are much stickier, right? People are much more loyal because, particularly for folks who have been around the block, they know that that's not common, that not every organization is like that. Not every manager is like that. And I think they do think twice about taking a leap and taking a risk if they truly believe that this company and this team has their back to support them to get where they want to go as fast as they can.
Yeah, very true. Thank you for sharing. We're sadly at an end. I've got, before we get to our two quick wrap up questions, I've got to ask for people listening to this that have probably been totally blown away by how you describe Rise and the culture and the opportunity to learn and grow. I assume you're hiring. So tell us a bit more about the sort of hiring plans at the moment and what are the things that our listeners can do to really stand out in that process for you?
Yes, we are hiring so much. If you're listening and you're interested, please check us out at writer.com/careers. We're especially hiring on our engineering product and design team and for sales account executives. So it's all there. You can find those opportunities, hear more about it, apply, speak with our recruiting team and kind of get moving. We really look for a record of excellence in your craft as it relates to the role. And I would say a record of living our values in your life and career, right? So connection, challenge constructively, and owning the impact and outcomes that you seek to create. There are so many different ways to do that. There are so many styles, right? We're really open to a vast, diverse range of people and how they do those things, but fundamentally that they are just shining examples of those values in action.
Great. Thank you so much. Be prepared for an onslaught of CVs and resumes to be coming your way.
Please bring it on.
But sadly, and then this has been a glorious conversation. I've enjoyed every second of it and, really, really inspired by your career story. I've got two final quick questions. This is 40-Minute Mentor. So I have to ask you, if you could be mentored by anyone, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Okay, I'm gonna do HR inside baseball. So the first who I've been lucky to actually meet a few times, and I would say is somewhat of a mentor, though I'd love to sort of deepen that if I could, is Laszlo Bach, who was the former head of people at Google for a decade, and I think in many ways set the stage for so much of what's happened in people in the technology sector in particular. And is just an incredible human and an incredible thought leader. It's just tremendous. The geeky one, I'll go way back, is a professor named Peter Senge, who wrote a book called The Fifth Discipline. And it's old. I think it's a few decades old. But remarkably, it is more relevant than ever in this era because he talks about what it takes to build a learning organization. And fundamentally, I think in this age of AI, organizations that know how to rapidly learn and rapidly evolve are the ones that are absolutely going to win. And so Peter Senge cracked this code a long time ago, many technology trends and evolutions before where we are today. And his recipe, I think, is still relevant.
What a legend. That's I'm sure there'll be people suddenly the sales of that book will go up because that sounds like a must read for any people leaders. Finally, Jevan, what is the last piece of advice, career advice, life advice that you'd like to leave our listeners with today?
That the lateral life, jumping around to different things that are not an obvious sort of linear path, is actually the most fun one in my view. I have done a number of things that when you sort of take just one step to the next step, a bunch of people in my life, recruiters are like, I don't understand this. Like, what is this? And I just have always been drawn to great founders and leaders, great teams working on interesting problems. And now down the road, it was an illogical path along the way, but I feel I just have such a richness of experience and such a joy from having met and learned from such a diverse set of people. And kind of cheesy, I feel like I'm just kind of a better human, right? Like if I have spent so much time with baristas and research scientists and AI engineers, and I see the humanity in each of them and what drives them, just it helps me sort of understand the world better.
Yeah, what a fantastic answer to end a truly fantastic conversation, Jevan. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your mentorship with us all. It's been a wonderful chat. So thank you so much.
Such a pleasure, James. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I really hope that you found it useful and inspiring. If we have left any questions unanswered, or if you have any feedback or guest recommendations for future series, then please make sure you get in touch on info@jbmc.co.uk. I often get asked by listeners how you can help us spread the word about 40 Minute Mentor. There are two simple ways you can help. Firstly, share this episode on your preferred social media platform, and LinkedIn is probably where I'm most likely to see it. And you can also leave us a review on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Every share on social media and review left on the podcast platforms really helps us to get 40 Minute Mentor in front of new audiences and share the power of mentorship even further. Thank you so much for your ongoing support, and I look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday for even more pocket sized mentorship.